Withering Bloom by J.M.J. Apple Bloom couldn't believe what she was seeing, and chills ran down her spine, causing her to tremble in place. For a moment, the filly started to run, panic's icy fingers caressing the innocent mind of the pony and igniting the natural defense mechanism. She found her lungs had faltered, and she heaved great bellows of air as she calmed herself. It couldn't hurt her. It was obviously beyond causing harm to anything now. Apple Bloom finally came to her senses as she looked down into the bush of the Everfree Forest floor at the mutilated remains of a filly. What remained was a shredded massacre. So much damage had been done that the corpse was barely distinguishable as a young pony, somewhat near Apple Bloom's age. Her coat was torn beyond recognition, and the meat of her body hung ripped and cut from some animal's teeth or claws. The poor filly had been eviscerated. Many of her organs lay in pieces below her stiff, lifeless legs, pulled from a sickening wound on her belly. The poor filly's head was similarly destroyed beyond recognition, and Apple Bloom swallowed hard, fighting a wave of nausea. Sorrow swept the young apple filly at this poor being robbed of its life. It was the first body she had ever seen, and despite being repulsed and terrified of it, her eyes couldn't look away. The child's heart sank and tears fell from her eyes as she looked the mangled carrion over again. She had no way of knowing who it had been. The body was too far damaged for that, and instead simply grieved for it. Whoever she was, she didn't deserve to be alone in the Everfree Forest. Some pony was probably looking for her. Apple Bloom sniffed and wiped her eyes, while her stomach ceased doing flips. Fear had blown away in the soft breeze, replaced with a terribly somber feeling that shook the apple filly to her core. She needed to tell some pony. This poor victim needed to be brought back to her family, where she might have some peace despite the horrific death she had found. A thought struck Apple Bloom like a bolt of lightning and caused her to jump and whip her head around to take in her surroundings. What if the bloodthirsty denizen that had feasted upon the nameless pony still stalked the area? Apple Bloom could tell that the kill had been fresh, by the way much of the blood had not yet dried. She needed to hightail it back to Sweet Apple Acres before she became an unidentifiable mass of sticky meat. Throwing caution to the wind, Apple Bloom dashed away from the corpse as quickly as her hooves could manage, deaf to the noise caused by the frantic gallop to escape the bowels of the Everfree Forest. Applejack had always warned her not to wander alone into the forest. The creatures that dwelled within were not like those who resided around Ponyville. They were wild and unpredictable, subject to only their individual needs at any given moment. Her big sister's words echoed through her mind, and she found herself looking over her shoulder as she ran, her mind developing maws full of teeth and blazing eyes in the shadows of the forest, causing her to run all the harder in an attempt to escape what may be in pursuit. The filly galloped faster than she ever had before, and expected her tiny legs to be aching from the overuse, but the adrenaline must have been blocking the pain associated with overtaxation of her diminutive frame. It seemed she had been running forever when she finally burst from the bushes and planted her hooves back onto the beloved ground of her home. Breathing hard, the filly turned to the boundary of the forest, backing away slowly and attempting to gather her wits while expecting the horrific jaws of a timber wolf to explode from the foliage and drag her back into its depths. Apple Bloom had never been afraid in the forest, and had explored it many times alone, or with the other Cutie Mark Crusaders. But that was going to change now. She had seen what could happen in the recesses of the wild world that bordered her home, and counted herself lucky that she hadn't stumbled across her own death in her many adventures in that interesting yet dangerous place. It felt as if a cart full of apples rested on her back, and she couldn't help but cry anew at the thought of how she may have been so terrifyingly close to her own demise so many times by the deliberate disobedience of exploring the forest. Sometimes adults really did know what they were talking about, and only the luck and resiliency of childhood shielded the impetuous and naturally curious foe from a tragic fate. For the first time in Apple Bloom's young life did she glimpse the real world, unadorned by the imagination of youth and the wonder of inexperience. The cold and remorseless landscape of reality flooded the filly's senses, breaking many of her juvenile perceptions. For a great many minutes, the yellow earth pony watered sweet-smelling grass with salty droplets, mourning not just the nameless pony, but the passage of her youth, for she knew that she could never return to the world that she had known. Apple Bloom was imprisoned in the colorless void of reality. Apple Bloom lifted her mournful eyes to the setting sun in the distance, bathed in the slowly closing light of the day. Her heart weighed as much as her older brother, but the filly pushed herself to her hooves and walked slowly towards the farmhouse, her head hanging low in abject misery. The young filly had endured a very trying day. Normally a very energetic and positive filly, Apple Bloom's moping gait was abnormal and painted the filly as a negative of herself. Her emotions had bottomed out, and she couldn't remember why she had even ventured into the woods earlier that day. It didn't matter. She wouldn't be stepping into that place again. "Phew, doggies! Fetch a stick, Winona!" Apple Bloom heard her sister's exclamation and turned her dreary gaze upward slightly to see Applejack toss the stick in her general direction with the family dog, Winona, giving chase as she followed the stick's flight. It landed a few feet from the troubled filly, and Winona skidded to a halt and happily snapped the piece of wood up in her mouth. Winona must have sensed Apple Bloom's sorrow as she paused, stick in mouth, and peered deeply at the young filly. A questioning aspect overlooked the dog's joyful mirth, and Apple Bloom even thought the canine seemed fearful. It was only after Applejack called for her that the dog broke her puzzlement and raced away to return to her loving master. "Good girl, Winona. I'm plumb tuckered. Let's knock it off for today, okay? You're such a good girl." Applejack scratched at the dog, smiling at her enthusiastically. Apple Bloom sat next to her sister and wiped her eyes with one foreleg, signaling to her sister that she needed to talk, and waited for AJ to finish with Winona. She waited for a dreadfully long time, and tilted her head up at the Stetson-wearing mare. "Applejack?" Her voice was weak, and strangled by the powerful emotions clutching her heart, and so when the orange mare didn't turn, she wasn't surprised. She breathed a thick sigh, while Applejack rubbed Winona's fuzzy tummy, the dog's leg kicking wildly as she did. Still nothing. Apple Bloom cast her dripping eyes up at her big sister, and forced her voice through the knot in her throat. "Applejack, I've got to talk to you. Something bad's happened." To her surprise, Applejack only kept rubbing the dog. Winona's head turned towards Apple Bloom, and that odd look replaced the joy of the belly rub. The young filly was suddenly overcome with irritation and turned quickly. A pony lay dead in the air-free forest, far from home and all alone, and Applejack didn't even notice the need that Apple Bloom embodied. She marched away from her sister, not looking back, to find Big Macintosh. He would listen. He wouldn't be too busy for her. Big Macintosh was chopping wood when Apple Bloom found him. She watched from a distance for a moment, seeing the axe split another thick log in twain, pieces falling to the ground in tandem. Applejack had been her first choice. She was durable, tough, and would have known exactly what to do. Not to say Big Macintosh wasn't strong, but he was shy, and carried a softer heart inside of his large frame. Applebloom was afraid that the dark cloud that burdened her would have much of the same effect on her big brother. She almost talked herself out of approaching him, but what if that monster returned for another snack, and the filly's body was moved, or completely devoured? She had to relate her story to an adult. It was only right that the poor foal be given her final piece. Applebloom slowly stepped near her big brother, pausing for safety behind a cart that held a multitude of logs left to be split. She watched the heavy axe strike again. Another piece of wood reduced to kindling before her eyes.
Big Mac, I gotta talk to you. Applejack won't listen. It's awful important.
Her voice was a note from a violin, high and sad. Big Mac turned in her direction, but didn't look at her. A curious expression across his features. His eyes flickered as if they were searching for something. Applebloom assumed he didn't see her, as she was somewhat hidden by a large wagon. She continued to speak, her voice quivering, as relating the memory caused water to swell in her eyes again.
There's a filly in the woods. She's dead. I found her while I was out playing. It's terrible, Big Mac. We gotta go get her. We can't leave her out there.
Her little head fell and wept again, waiting for Big Mac to respond. She felt miserable and knew he would pull her close and comfort her, his warmth filling her up and silently letting her know that everything would be okay. A thundering crack broke the filly from her misery as the axe tore through the flesh of another log, its rent in pieces falling to the ground. Applebloom waited expectantly of her brother and went on with her story.
I shouldn't have been out there, but it just makes me so sad to think about.
Another thick tearing sound filled the air, and Applebloom jerked her head upward to see her brother going about his chores, as if her words meant nothing. Applebloom couldn't believe what she was seeing. She didn't know what kind of strange game her older siblings were playing, but she simply couldn't believe they wouldn't listen to her. A life was gone, and they just didn't seem to care. Frustration ate the filly's mind, and she burst into a wail as she darted towards the farmhouse. Stupid games at a time like this, it was just too much for the filly to handle. She was furious at the moment, and hated them for it. Did they think she was making it up? Big Mac hadn't even been upset that she admitted to being in the ever-free forest. She threw the door open to the house, and loudly stomped up the steps, before entering her bedroom and slamming the door behind her. They would be sorry for ignoring her when they stopped laughing at their little joke long enough to realize she was upset. She would just climb into her bed and wait for them to come up and check on her. She just couldn't grasp how they could act like that. They just didn't care. Applebloom pulled the blankets of her bed over her head and buried her face in the pillow, screaming once to let out frustration and burden. The pillow muffled her agonized wails, and a sudden exhaustion swept over her. Her nerves had been arduously taxed and unknown to the little filly. Her subconscious demanded time to process the horrendous events of the day. Her tiny eyes closed. They felt warm and puffy from the many tears that she had shed that day. The blackness took her, giving her a moment of respite in what was the most stressful day of her life. She was being hunted. Applebloom could feel the predatory eyes of the creature on her, and she felt her heart beating far faster than it had before. Panic was settling in, and she felt rows of tiny bumps popping on her flesh, her coat standing up as the oppressive feeling gained a tighter grip around the filly's mind. Her eyes were wide and searching. She breathed in giant lungfuls of air. A twig snapped and she shrieked. She needed to get home to Sweet Apple Acres. It wasn't too far off, and the creatures of the forest wouldn't venture out of the tree line. If she could just make a break for home, she would be safe. A growl came from behind her, and she broke in terror, panic forcing her decisions. She needed to get away quickly, or it would catch her and kill her. She screamed loudly and scampered deeper into the woods. Her legs pumped wildly as she tore through bushes and low-hanging limbs, earning several painful scratches across her body. She didn't have time to care about scratches. Behind her, limbs snapped, and the sound of a large predator tearing through the brush sang horror to her ears. The filly tore through another bush and found herself in a small clearing. She knew where she was, and adrenaline cleared her frightened mind for a moment. She realized her legs were screaming from multiple abrasions, and several thorns poked from bleeding wounds. But something much worse was clear. She had run in the wrong direction. She was further from the farm than she had been. Another throaty growl broke the apple filly's thoughts, and the terrifying wooden face of the largest timberwolf that could ever exist pushed through the foliage, its glowing green eyes promising death to the filly. She screamed and backed away a few steps until her rump pressed up against the bark of a large tree. The eyes of the beast entranced the filly, and she was paralyzed under the gaze. Her mind screamed for her to run, but her body rejected the command. She brought her forelegs up to protect herself from the monster, but she knew it was a useless gesture. Through her shivering limbs, she witnessed the beast open its drooling maw and lunge, those huge teeth encompassing all of her vision, as a scream broke from her throat. The door to Apple Bloom's room thundered open, causing the filly to tumble out of her bed, to crash out of sight to the hard floor. She gasped in fright. The monster was here. She brought her forelegs up to protect herself from the jaws of the terrible creature.
Apple Bloom, you in here?
Her sister's voice was loud and shaking with fright, but Apple Bloom realized with relief that she was at home. The monster was only a dream, brought on by the nightmare she had seen in real life. Applejack must not have seen her fall out of the bed, and she considered not answering. Her sister hadn't wanted to hear what she had to say earlier, so why should she care now?
Did you find her?
Another voice broke from the door. It was Big Macintosh. He rarely spoke, and when he did, it was out of necessity. It was so odd to hear him string together a sentence, no matter how small, that Apple Bloom understood that the situation must be important.
No. Oh, Mac, do you think she went out into the forest again?
Applejack answered. Apple Bloom, understanding the severity of the situation, popped her head over the bed.
Hold on, I'm right here, but...
She was too late, and only saw shadows moving away from her door. With a quick glance to the window, she saw that it was too late in the evening, probably past her bedtime. She must have slept through dinner. She got to her hooves and darted across the room, hearing Applejack and Big Mac downstairs.
We gotta find her. That place ain't safe for any pony, let alone a little filly. I'm gonna whoop her good when we find her little rump.
Applejack's voice quivered again, and Apple Bloom tossed any notion of paying her family back out the window. She didn't like making them worry.
Yup.
I hope she's okay.
Just as Apple Bloom landed on the first floor, she saw the front door slam shut. She quickly followed after her older siblings, calling their names as she pried the heavy front door open. Her eyes took a moment to adjust to the night, but she could see the bouncing light of a lantern and two silhouettes within, heading across the field towards the Everfree Forest. It was dark, and creatures of the forest were far more awake at night. Finding the body could wait until morning.
Applejack, Big Mac, wait!
They must not have heard her as their forms began to shrink in the distance. She heard the definitive sound of barking as Winona joined them. Apple Bloom, unable to shake the mutilated body from her head, gave chase to her siblings, afraid whatever ate the filly may find them as well. Her legs pumped wildly to catch up. They had stopped at the tree line, and Apple Bloom could see Applejack holding up what looked like one of her ribbons. down for Winona to smell. She called on all of her reserves to sprint towards the longer leg ponies, but Winona howled and leapt into the darkness of the woods, Applejack and Big Mac close behind her.
Wait, it's dangerous in there.
Applebloom skidded to a halt at the forest line and nervously muttered to herself. She didn't know what to do. She hollered loudly, but the forest was too good at muffling sounds, and she knew that her siblings wouldn't hear her. She didn't want to go into that place again, but she knew she had to do it. There was a bloodthirsty beast lurking within, and she couldn't stand the thought of her family becoming like that poor filly. A sudden surge of courage took the tiny pony, and she dashed into the forest, calling after her family. The filly was smaller than her siblings were, and could maneuver through the straggly brush more easily. Following the barks of Winona, Applebloom began to gain ground on her larger kin. Her lungs burned and she panted as she followed the direction of the barks.
Stop!
She cried, ducking thorns and limbs. Winona had a good sense of smell, and she must have picked up on the stench of rot, because she was leading them straight towards the body. Applebloom grew more adamant in her fervor to intercept her family before they crossed into the beast's hunting grounds. She needed to warn them and get them out of this celestial forsaken forest. A light blinked in the distance. It was Applejack's lantern. It had to be. Applebloom could swear she heard the sounds of the beast stirring all around her. It was coming for them. It smelled their delicious meat and was coming for another banquet of pony flesh. She was running out of time.
Applejack!
Throwing aside her scrumples, she allowed her body to wrestle through the vines, weeds, and limbs. Any scrape was far less important than the well-being of her loving family. The light from the lantern grew, and she could hear their voices as she closed the distance.
Winona, find her, girl. You gotta find Applebloom.
Applejack's voice was dripping with fear, and Applebloom could barely make out the shapes of her family against the light. She continued to push through the dense forest, her body feeling no pain despite the many briars she knew she had run through. Winona began barking wildly, just as Applebloom came into the clearing, finally having reached her brother and sister.
What is it, Winona? Did you find Applebloom?
They were struggling to bring the lantern over what Winona had been barking, but Applebloom knew. Winona had found the corpse of the filly.
Applejack, Big Mac, we gotta get out of here now!
Applebloom leapt in front of the pair, but their eyes seemed to look right through her. The lantern shed its illumination across her, and as she turned to regard the body, she was frozen by a sudden cold in her tummy as she realized she was not casting a shadow. The light just seemed to pass right through her.
Oh no, Mac. I told her not to.
Applejack, the most stalwart of the Apple family, burst into tears and slumped down to her haunches as she gazed onto the remains of the mutilated filly. She sobbed deeply, was joined by her older brother, his whooping sobs breaking the night air. The pair clutched each other for comfort, but none could be found. Applebloom couldn't move. Shock had devoured her, and she could only watch as Applejack reached clean through her tiny body motionless, as the larger foreleg pulled something that had been hidden under a wild fern. Winona turned towards Applebloom's seemingly immaterial form and howled sorrowfully, her eyes steeped in despair. Applejack pulled a torn cloth through Applebloom's torso and broke into a long, deep wail of loss. Applebloom felt as if her mind was pulling apart at the sight. Resting on Applejack's shaking hoof were the tattered remains of Applebloom's mane ribbon, mangled and stained crimson from her last few moments of life. And that was Withering Bloom. Thank you very much for listening.